My kids are disappointed that is Michael Jackson and not Weird Al. See, they're making a release of a new one of those musical biopics that they've been doing. They're doing one on Michael Jackson now. I'm kind of excited about that. I'm really interested to see how that goes. Yeah, anyway, I can't get distracted too much. We've got a lot to cover this morning. All right. They're back. It's official. They're back. Now, I'm not talking about the Pirates or the Penguins. They had a rough night last night, so I can't be bragging on them. Yeah, they had a pretty rough night. I'm not talking about sports. The irony is that I am talking about something bathed in yellow and popping up all over the region. Dandelions. Dandelions are back. My yard is covered in dandelions. Last week, it was green. It was perfectly green. Just a few weeks prior to that, it was white with snow. So the winter that we thought would never end had most vegetation in its seemingly endless, frigid grasp. And as much as I was sick of the winter and ready for the warmth of spring, there was a little part of me that didn't mind not having to deal with weeds. But here we are. Mere weeks into spring, after just a handful of days where the temperature is above freezing, minus today, and in the proverbial blink of an eye, they're back. And they're back with a vengeance. Now, to be clear, I don't mind dandelions. I don't mind clover. We don't go crazy trying to stop it. That's good for the pollinators. Many of you have enjoyed the honey that come from those. My turtle loves the dandelion leaves. It's life. What do I care if we have patches of yellow and purple across my yard? The kids play in it all the same. And the benefit is I don't have to worry about them accidentally stepping into a puddle of chemicals with names I can't pronounce anyway. So there's that benefit. I only mention it because every spring when the dandelions return, I'm reminded, at least in part, of some of the things that Paul talks about in many of his letters, but in particular here in the first and second chapter of the book of Romans. Just as weeds pop up seemingly out of nowhere every spring, so does my penchant for sin, despite all of my best efforts to keep it at bay. This morning we're continuing our tour of the book of Romans through this series I've been calling, I introduced last week, called Empires and Eternity. And as we continue this series, we need to keep in mind that which we've already discussed. So kind of a quick recap. The Apostle Paul wrote this letter to a group of people following Jesus in the city of Rome, in the heart of the Roman Empire. And in his opening remarks, Paul made an incredibly bold statement. It wasn't just, as we said last week, it wasn't just a theological statement, it wasn't just a spiritual statement, but it was also a political statement. Paul wrote that he was a slave of Jesus to proclaim the gospel of God, to proclaim the lordship of Jesus. In his very first sentence, Paul used terminology which heralds of Caesar would have used to proclaim the good news of the empire, the good news of Caesar, the gospel of Caesar. He literally steals their language. And in so doing, Paul is thumbing his nose at the notion that Caesar is Lord and boldly proclaiming that the only true Lord is the Messiah, Jesus. In so doing, Paul declared that the gospel is not merely some small religious or spiritual movement, but rather a completely redefining and recalibration of life. Every aspect of life, not just what we do on Sunday, not just what we do among our church friends, every aspect of life is to be placed under the lordship of Jesus. But then, he immediately, after those opening words, pivots into a headfirst process of defining what the gospel is for his readers. And in order to define it properly, he decides that he needs to help his readers understand their need for this good news. So between the second half of Romans chapter 1 and pretty much all of Romans chapter 2, that's what Paul is doing. He's not pulling any punches. He's hitting his readers squarely in the nose, pointing out our addiction to sin. In the first two chapters, Paul completely dismantles any notion that we might have that we are good people, or that you and I can live a life that is even remotely pleasing to God. outside of Jesus. He separates the world into two groups of people, effectively, in Romans 1 and Romans 2. He describes people who are outside the church, but then he quickly pivots to those who are also in the church, reiterating what David wrote years prior in Psalm 51, "For I was born a sinner. Yes, from the moment my mother conceived me." We all know that sin is not a very popular thing to talk about. And I get it. People have been beat over the head for years with some of the very words that Paul penned in the first couple chapters of Romans. Paul addressed some very specific sins that were going on in the city of Rome, some specific sins of the people who were unaffiliated with the Christian movement, unaffiliated with the church. And if you're ever tempted to believe, as we often are, if you're ever tempted to believe that our culture is more sinful, more broken, or more depraved than any other culture in history, all you need to do is read through these opening verses of Paul's letter to the Romans. In these opening verses, Paul describes some, what I'll simply call relational sins. And those same sins continue on into the modern era. And what's most ironic is the fact that the sort of relational sins that Paul describes here, the sort of relationships that Paul describes here, and I'm just going to need to trust that you're reading this chapter along with me, because for modesty's sake, I can't get into the explicit words that Paul himself uses. But the sort of relationship Paul describes here were largely being promoted through pagan religious movements of the day. In other words, people were partaking in these relational sins in large part because they were being endorsed and encouraged by the popular religion of the day. Does that not sound familiar at all? See, even today, many people base their entire worldview, they devise their own take on religion and all religious belief on their penchant for the very same sins which Paul describes here in ancient Rome. Today, people actively search for churches or religious groups based on whether or not they endorse or affirm some of the very same things Paul describes here in Romans. And what that should tell us is that other than the technology we use and the clothes that we wear, the style of clothes that we wear, other than that, Paul would largely see very little difference between our world and his when he wrote this letter 2,000 years ago. But friend, here's the kicker. Just like Paul's primary audience existed in a deeply broken and deeply depraved world, the way he opened his letter, the way he opened this letter should hit us just as hard with the very same punch to the gut with which it hit those in the first century church. Because if you're reading this, and I want to keep encouraging you, because we're not going to be able to talk about every passage verse by verse. I want to encourage you to continue reading along with us. If you read this, you should have noticed right away he starts addressing things that are going on outside the church, with those inside the church would have been nodding their head along with. Some people might have even shouted a hearty amen to what Paul was saying. Do you see what those people are doing out there? Do you see the perversion? Do you see the debauchery? Do you see their sin? How ugly it is, how gross it is, how much in opposition to God that they are standing. But then he writes these words in the first verse of the second chapter. He says, "You may think you can condemn such people, but you are just as bad, and you have no excuse." Just hold there for a moment, because I know there's more to read, but ow, that hurts. I mean, just sit with those words for a moment. Listen as I reread them. You may think you can condemn those people out there. You think you can condemn what they're doing out there in the world. But you are just as bad. And you have no excuse. When you say they are wicked and should be punished, you are condemning yourself, for you who judge others do these very same things. Wow. Just wow. Paul completely turns the tables on his audience. His primary focus isn't condemning those outside the church for their sin. He doesn't hide from the sin. He acknowledges the sin. He acknowledges that the way the world exists is in opposition to the way God designed it. He does not shy away from that. But his primary focus isn't condemning those outside the church. Those are lost people. They're already living in darkness. What are we to expect? Paul's real focus here in the opening chapters of his letter to the Romans, it isn't those outside. It's those within. It's the religious people. It's the self-identifying Christian people. Paul's addressing people who have grown to believe that they're good people. People who believe they're special, uniquely righteous because of their relationship with God. People who act holier than thou and go out of their way to condemn those who not only live differently, but live differently because they believe differently. So the first lesson, when I read Romans 1 and 2, the first lesson just jumps off the page. It's one of the most insidious sins within the church is the sin of hypocrisy. One of the most insidious sins within the church is the sin of hypocrisy. Listen as Paul continues writing. He says, we know that God, in his justice, will punish anyone who does such things. Since you judge others for doing these things, why do you think you can avoid God's judgment when you do the same? For thousands of years, this has been one of the biggest struggles within the church, and it still is. This is why I struggle to listen to pastors who primarily preach on morality and cultural issues, while refusing to acknowledge their own brokenness. What I describe as and some of you will laugh because you've heard this before, the Christian industrial complex is largely built on the whole idea that we can change the world by only speaking about what's going on outside the church's walls. It's all about pointing to what's wrong out there. When we spend our time focusing exhaustively on the sins of the world and condemning those outside the church for their wickedness, we grant ourselves the privilege of ignoring just how deeply flawed and just how deeply broken we are personally. We are masters of deflection in the church. When we deflect, it makes us feel better. It makes us appear righteous. It makes us look good. Look at how dark it is out there. It puts us in the position of judge and jury as we stand back pointing to the mistakes and the failures of others. But friends, living this way makes us no different than the Pharisees and the religious leaders of Jesus' day. And you remember what Jesus had to say about them, right? I put a little passage, if you needed a reminder, in your handout. Matthew 23, Jesus says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees. You what? Hypocrites. You are like whitewashed tombs which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness." So what's the answer then? What's the solution? Well, I think Paul addresses it in the very next verse. But before we get to that, let's go back to those pesky dandelions for a moment, shall we? You see, I'm sure I live in a relatively nice neighborhood. I like to think of it as a nice neighborhood. Many of you have been to my house. You know where I live. I'm sure that I have a neighbor or two in my community who hate my yard. I'm sure of it. Now, to be clear, no one's ever said anything to me. No one's ever looked at me funny. No one's ever given me like weird vibes. But I'm sure, because it's such a common thing to criticize your neighbors about, I am sure that there are people in my community who look at my yard, they see the dandelions, they see the violets, they see the clover, they see the crabgrass, and then they not only snub their noses at my less than perfect lawn, but they might also harbor a bit of anger towards me regarding it. Because if they are the type of person who has spent hours and lots of money cleaning up and creating the perfect green lawn, my lawn's ruining it for them. Because the seeds of my weeds are getting into their lawn and they are just spreading, right? Again, to be clear, no one's actually said anything to me about it. I'm projecting, but it's a safe bet. It's a fairly common thing to judge your neighbors about. The thing about it, though, is while they're harboring that potential judgment and anger towards me, what they don't see, the thing that I see, the thing that Aaron and I see, is not simply a yard full of dandelions. We see a yard in which nearly every neighborhood child plays. You see, my lawn happens to be the largest and flattest space, because we live on a big hill. It's the largest, flattest space in the community. And it also happens to be between two streets, so nearly every house in our immediate vicinity has a direct line of sight to our grass, to our house. Which means you probably need to shut your shades every once in a while, for one thing. But the second thing is because my kids are of an age where they like to play with the neighborhood kids, and all the neighborhood kids love them, they all play in my yard. It's the yard for baseball and football and soccer. You don't leave a car in the driveway because it's going to get a bat to the window eventually. It's just going to happen. But that's what I love about my yard. The kids love it, and we celebrate that. We embrace that. We see it as an opportunity to steward that which God has blessed us with. And as such, we've chosen not to spray our lawn with, like I said before, chemicals that could harm one of the kids. Maybe they're allergic. They have a sensitivity. We don't know. So we don't fight off the weeds. Again, that's not to judge those who do, but explains why we've chosen not to. When I read Romans 2, that's one of the vibes I take away from Paul's words. Not that you should allow weeds to grow in your yard. That's not what my point is. Not that you should allow kids to run around and play. But that we have a responsibility to steward the most sacred gift we've all been given. Look at what Paul says in verse 4. He says, "Don't you see how wonderfully kind, tolerant, and patient God is with you? Does that mean nothing to you? Can't you see that his kindness is intended to turn you from your sin?" Here's the lesson for your handout. Grace is a gift meant to steward holiness. Grace is a gift which is meant to steward holiness. I don't know why or where, rather, I don't know where we tend to get so far off track. But like most Christians throughout history, we have an absolute penchant to treat grace as a license for sin. We convince ourselves. We say things like, "Oh, well, Jesus forgave us for this anyway, right? We can do whatever we want now, right? Jesus paid for it anyway. It's already paid for. I'm going to do what I want." Of course, that's not true. We know Paul famously says in many places things about this, but I pull out Galatians chapter 5 where Paul says, "You, my brothers and sisters, you are called to be free, but don't use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbor as yourself." When we read further through Romans 2 with this spirit in mind, it's hard not to pick up on this recurring theme. Paul, again, doesn't pull any punches. He writes, continuing on in verse 5, "Because you are stubborn and refuse to turn away from your sin, you are storing up terrible punishment for yourself. For a day of anger is coming, and when God's righteous judgment will be revealed. He will judge everyone according to what they have done. He will give eternal life to those who keep on doing good, seeking after the glory and honor and immortality that God offers. But he will pour out his anger and his wrath on those who live for themselves, who refuse to obey the truth and instead live lives of wickedness." If I were you, I would underline or circle what Paul has to say in verse 8. He will pour out his anger and wrath on those who live for themselves. That's the very definition of sin there, friends. Living life for yourself. Every sin at its root is driven by that statement right there. It's motivated out of selfishness. What can I get out of this life? What pleasures might I enjoy? What gratification can I seek with no regard for what God desires from me, or no regard for what others might bless others? Grace isn't the freedom to live and do as you please. Grace is a gift meant to liberate you from the endless cycle of attempting to reconcile yourself to God. That's what it is. It's a gift. And it's a gift when understood accurately from the perspective of a wretched sinner. It should humble us and draw us to our knees. The famous 19th century theologian Charles Spurgeon, He said it far more eloquently than I ever could. He says, I believe the holier a man becomes, the more he mourns over the unholiness which remains in him. That's what the grace of God should generate in all of us. Not a life of self-righteous judgment towards others, but a life of humility and reverence for what our holy and righteous God has done for us. All right, let's wrap up this chapter with one final lesson. Throughout the rest of Romans 2, Paul goes down an interesting road that can be challenging for people today to understand. And I completely understand why. He begins to differentiate between the Jews and the Gentiles here in Romans 2. He writes things like, picking up in verse 9, there will be trouble and calamity for everyone who keeps on doing what is evil, for the Jew first and also for the Gentile. But there will be glory and honor and peace from God for all who do good, for the Jew first, but also for the Gentile. For God does not show favoritism. In order to understand what Paul is getting at here, it's important to remember his immediate context. Paul didn't write this letter. I know this may shock you, but Paul didn't write this letter originally with the understanding that Christians living in a city called Pittsburgh in the year 2026 would be reading it. He didn't know what a yinzer even was yet. Paul wrote this letter to his audience, his immediate audience. And that was an audience of young Christians living in the city of Rome, made up of folks who come from both a Jewish and a non-Jewish background, called Gentiles. This church consisted of folks who used to be Orthodox Jews, as well as pagan Gentiles. And his point throughout this section isn't so much to highlight the differences between the two groups, but to tie them together under the same equal judgment for their sins. That's his primary point. Even though the Gentiles didn't have the law like the Jews, Paul argues that God wrote it on their hearts instinctively. And he talks about how they honor it just by living well and serving others. The Jews, on the other hand, had the law. And they actively chose to dishonor it, so their judgment is quite clear. And this is where Paul lands the plane in a way that should make every single one of us just a little bit uncomfortable. Because after walking through all of this, after leveling the playing field between the Jews and the Gentiles, religious and the pagan, he effectively asks a question that cuts straight to the heart of it all. He asks the question, which is basically, what kind of fruit is your life actually producing? It's one thing to know the truth. It's another thing to live it. Listen to what Paul has to say a few verses later, picking up in verse 23. He says, you're so proud of knowing the law. He's talking specifically to the Jewish Christians. You're so proud of knowing the law. But you dishonor God by breaking it. No wonder the scriptures say, the Gentiles blaspheme the name of God because of you. That's a heavy statement. Paul's saying you can claim to know God, you can claim to represent him, you can claim to have the truth, you can claim to have a unique relationship with him, but yet the way you live is causing people who don't know him to actually reject him. Think about that for a moment. It's not that just that their hypocrisy was a personal issue and they were struggling with their salvation. Their hypocrisy was a witness issue. The Gentiles weren't blaspheming God because they had studied theology and rejected it. It wasn't because that they had studied Old Testament scripture and decided this wasn't the path they wanted to go down. Paul's saying that the Gentiles were blaspheming God because they looked at his people and they didn't see anything different amongst them. And if we're honest, that hits a little too close to home, doesn't it? The question isn't, do you go to church? The question isn't, do you know the right answers? The question isn't what. The question is, when people look at you and they look at your life, do they see something that points them to Jesus, or does it push them away? I mean, Jesus succinctly put it this way, by their fruit, you will recognize them. Not by their words, not by their posts on social media, not by their opinions, not by their voting record. By their fruit. So here's the final lesson from Romans 2. Your life is your sermon. What's it saying about Jesus? Your life is your sermon. What's it saying about Jesus? That's completely what Paul's getting at. Grace has been given to you. Truth has been revealed to you. The gospel has transformed you. So what are you doing with it? What is your life producing? Because if the grace of God has truly taken root in your heart, it won't just change what you say. It will change what you bear. And friends, the world is watching. So here we are. Spring has come. The ground has finally thawed, I think. I know I made fun of Punxsutawney Phil, but I'm pretty sure we can say that the ground is thawed. If there's a snow in May, all right, yeah, you can let me know. And just like every year, what was hidden beneath the surface, it didn't stay hidden for long, did it? The dandelions came back, and if we're honest, just like them, so does our sin. And that's what Paul's been writing about all along so far. You can dress it up, you can mow it over, you can pretend it's not there, but eventually what's rooted in the soil of your heart is going to break through the surface of your life. The question isn't if something will grow, the question is what is going to grow. What fruit is your life producing? Because here's the tension we've been sitting in all throughout this whole message this morning. If all we do is point out the weeds in everyone else's yards and cast judgment on those weeds, we've missed it. We've missed the point. If all we do is pretend that our yard is fine when it's completely overrun, we've also missed it. But if we allow the kindness and the grace and the patience of God to actually do its work in us, well, that changes everything. You don't clean up your life so that God will love you. God loves you because he's willing to get his hands dirty in your life. He steps right into the mess. He steps into the overgrowth. He walks into the places that you've ignored, the places that you justified, the places that you've tried to keep hidden. And by his grace, he begins to uproot what doesn't belong and cultivate something new. That's what the gospel's all about. Not that you and I have it figured out, not that we've figured out how to manage all the weeds, but that Jesus stepped into the field. He took on our sin, and through his death and his resurrection made a way for something entirely new to grow. So don't walk out of here this morning thinking, I need to try harder. That's not the message of Romans. Walk out of here asking, have I truly surrendered all of my life to him? Because when you do, that's when the grace will take root. It won't just cover your sin, it will start to change the soil. And over time, sometimes slowly, sometimes painfully, but always faithfully, over time God begins to produce something different. Not weeds, but fruit. Fruit that reflect him. Fruit that points people to Jesus. Fruit that makes the world stop and say, there's something different about that person. And that's the life we've been called to. So as you walk out into the world this week, as you go back into your homes, your workplaces, your neighborhoods, just remember that your life is a field. Something is growing. And by the grace of God, it doesn't have to be those dandelions that have always been there. Let's close with a word of prayer.